So, Tim, I want to start with where we left off the last time we talked on the Lawfare podcast, which was that the counteroffensive was starting, um, both on the ground as a Ukrainian military project and on Substack as a Tim Mack journalistic project. And now it was a very, I think, hopeful and exciting moment. Now we are some number of months later. It is a significantly less hopeful moment, but you haven't changed the name of the publication. So bring us up to date. Where are we in the Ukraine-Russia wars and your coverage of them?
Well, let's start with the publication, and then we'll get into the. So the Counteroffensive was a publication I launched last May, and what we've done is we tried to zoom in on personal stories as a lens through which we can view the war in Ukraine. And what we're aiming for is a more holistic form of war correspondence, telling the stories of the war through personal stories and using that empathy. That connection between people here in Ukraine and people thousands of miles away as a way for us to tell deeper stories that we find that people would be more interested in. So over the last year, we've told stories about the trenches, but also stories about Ukrainian folk music and Ukrainian language dictation, stories about religion, stories about the cuisine here. And what we're trying to do is provide a much more comprehensive view of the war, of Ukraine, not just as a place where war is happening, but a place that's interesting in and of itself, where conflict just happens to be occurring. Now, as the name suggests, we drove a lot of inspiration from that optimism of about a year ago, which was that Ukraine had liberated large portions of its territory and was planning to be on the march in a very aggressive counteroffensive, and that there was a lot of optimism and hopefulness about what that counteroffensive might be able to do. Here we are a year later, and the counteroffensive campaign, the Ukrainian operation, has stalled and could rightly be called, the situation on the front rightly could be called a stalemate. And in fact, one in which Russia has seized the initiative. And when I say seize the initiative, what I mean is that they are able to dictate the tempo and places in which combat is now occurring. And that Ukraine is on the defensive. A big reason for that loss in optimism is a series of military operations last year, which did not break through Russian lines as hoped for. There are a number of reasons for that, and we can kind of get into it. But from a bird's eye view right now, what I can say is that the pessimism and morale in Ukraine is about as low as I've ever seen it, and it's palpable. It's there's a lot of people who have spent more than 2 years now fighting in pretty horrifying conditions, with no end in sight, with no kind of broad strategy from the Ukrainian government as to what happens next. And that's not all the Ukrainian government's fault. The Ukrainian government can't plausibly create a strategy for how to win the war if they don't know what tools they'll have to use. And America's reluctance and dithering on the issue of aid to Ukraine has kind of jammed things up, stalled things at a strategic level here in Ukraine. And that has impacts not just on a military planning level, but you just put yourself in the position of a 25-year-old Ukrainian male who's interested in mobilizing, trying to decide whether or not to join the military. And I gotta say, a lot of people would rightly be reluctant to put their lives on the line when they don't know that the government has a clear strategy for how to proceed and how to win. But that all starts with, did Ukraine's allies and friends who've promised to be with Ukraine till the end, did they just lose focus? Did they just lose their own initiative? Did they just get distracted by other kind of foreign policy shiny objects? And how much blame will Ukrainians have in the medium term? How much betrayal will they feel in the medium term, having been encouraged to fight by its Western allies, and then possibly, depending on what happens next, abandoned at their moment of greatest need? These are kind of I'm happy to expand on any of those, but these are kind of the big things that I'm thinking about right now.
Yeah, so let's start with that sense of abandonment and betrayal. To what extent, you've framed it in the future tense. How betrayed will people feel? How abandoned will people feel? Let's talk about that question in the present tense for a minute, because if I were Ukrainian watching U.S. domestic politics, and watching the congressional front in this war, I would feel abandoned and betrayed already. And so I want to turn your question on the present tense and just ask you: is that sense of betrayal extant already, or is there a tolerance for the idea that the United States has its own domestic politics, and in a kind of Churchillian way, we will do the right thing after exhausting all other possible alternatives?
I wanna say that it's deep frustration that hasn't yet coalesced into a sense of betrayal, but that's imminent, right? I think that the sense of betrayal calcifies if there's a final policy decision that's made in the United States, and either and the choice is made not to proceed with aid, or to essentially withdraw from supporting Ukraine. I don't think they're there yet, and I think that Ukrainians have sufficient memory to recall that the city that I'm in, Kyiv, might not be in Ukrainian hands without American support. And so there's still a surplus of goodwill there. That said, I think that if America and the U.S. Congress doesn't get its act together soon, I think it will turn into a sense of betrayal.
So let's talk about the different components here, because one that we hear about a lot is the American dithering, and people like me who shine lasers on buildings to remind people of the dithering are kind of obsessed with that. But there is also some significant failure on the Ukrainian government's part, starting with the really the overpromise of the counteroffensive, and that has, as it became clear that that was not going to pan out in the fashion that many people expected it to, including clearly the Ukrainian leadership, there has been something of a return of politics to Ukraine at a domestic level. So talk about that. How angry are people at their own government's failure to deliver what had been, if not explicitly promised, at least impliedly promised?
Yeah, I mean, as time goes on, Zelensky's approval rating has dropped, but it's dropped from the 90s to a level that any Western politician would be very glad to have any day of the week. Down to the 60s and 70s. I think what you're alluding to is the removal of the top military commander in Ukraine, General Zaluzhny, who was removed after a series of comments that included an acknowledgement to The Economist magazine that the war had reached a stalemate. And that concession is the classic political gaffe, which is accidentally telling the truth when it's not in alignment with the political class's interests and messaging. And the interesting thing is that Zaluzhny is probably the only person in Ukraine with a higher approval rating than Zelensky himself. That the military retains a huge amount of trust, that frontline troops have a huge amount of respect for Zelensky, and he was recently removed, and he remains an advisor and is now going to take a diplomatic role with the Ukrainian government in the United Kingdom. So out of Ukraine. There is a significant amount of frustration to the extent that I have not seen before. There are a lot of questions being asked about the Ukrainian government and whether it's made the right decisions, both in terms of the counteroffensive. And then, of course, people are asking, how did Ukraine get into this position in the first place? Why was Ukraine in such a vulnerable position when the full-scale invasion began? And even questions all the way back to the 90s and Ukraine's decision to give up its stockpile of nuclear weapons in exchange for security assurances that obviously weren't worth very much, given the subsequent invasion by Russia. I think that there's a lot of there's a lot of political discussion right now, which is something that hasn't been as present over much of the last 2 years. Here's the issue: there's no election in sight. There were originally, prior to the full-scale invasion, this March, there were scheduled to be elections in Ukraine, but constitutionally, from a legal perspective, Ukraine cannot have an election while there's martial law and when there's war underway. So from a legal perspective, there isn't this release valve for people to be able to express their opinions on things like, should Ukraine negotiate with Russia and on what terms, and and what would be appropriate to concede, if anything. What would be the appropriate strategy for winning the war? What does victory mean, and what are we willing to do in order to achieve victory? What kind of sacrifices are we willing to do? Is another round of mobilization, is that appropriate? A lot of people are reluctant to mobilize hundreds of thousands of more people, which is probably what would be needed in order to continue the prosecution of this war. So all of these things. All of these issues are present in Ukrainian society, but because of the law prohibiting these elections, they're not really able to be discussed in a frank way. And public surveys right now show that most Ukrainians don't want an election, don't feel like it's appropriate, for both the legal reasons and for the reason of logistics, which is the second kind of main barrier, that it would be difficult to have free and fair elections while there's active combat and there's many soldiers on the front lines, and that would be difficult to create a system to allow them to vote. And then finally, there's the issue of potential disenfranchisement, which is, what do we do about all these people who are Ukrainians living behind Russian lines in occupied areas? How will they be represented, if at all? All those challenges make it so that politics are much more difficult and elections are much more difficult to conceive of now or in the near future.
But, eventually you run into this problem as a democratic society fighting an authoritarian society, that your claim to be a democratic society, when you're in a persistent state of martial law without a renewed mandate for the incumbent administration, the British government did it for a long time during World War II. I think they suspended elections for the entirety of the war. It's not undoable, but it does create a real friction with the idea of a democratic society. Is there any discussion about, how you preserve your democratic legitimacy and your status as a free society in a martial law situation where you're suspending elections over a long period of time?
The World War II comparison is interesting because you'll remember that that the British government created a coalition government that was as broad as possible, and Churchill specifically wanted to bring in people who had been antagonists in order to broaden the legitimacy of his coalition government. And then you can, of course, point to the United States having held elections during periods of unrest and during the Civil War, and there's a history of that as well. That said, the public opinion polls just do not show an interest in elections right now. The vast majority of people would oppose it if it were brought up as a potential as something that they could potentially do. I think most Ukrainians that I've spoken to on this matter would say that they need to focus on winning the war before they can continue with elections. Now, Ukrainians do not have a history over the last 20 years of staying quiet when they have demands. There have been, over the last 20 years, two major street protest-driven revolutions that have compelled political change in this country. So I think Ukrainians very instinctively understand that if it gets to a point where they feel like they're no longer able to express their voice, they know exactly what to do, and they've shown that they can compel change by doing it. So I mean that's the situation that's in place right now. It's a difficult. I think that many Ukrainians would chafe at the suggestion that outsiders ought to come in and dictate to them how their democracy ought to operate, and when they should hold elections, and the extent to which they can be considered a free society. From my window, I hear demonstrations in central Kyiv on a very frequent basis, and they're certainly free to do that in ways that you could not do in Moscow.
So I agree with you. I have heard no criticism of the government for not holding elections, or for not seeking what would really be required, which is seeking a legal change in order to hold elections. One thing I have heard criticism of the government for a lot recently is press freedom issues, and the sense that the Zelensky government is playing tough with the press. There's been some visible friction between the Zelensky government and the Kyiv Independent, the major English language publication. And there's a fair bit of criticism of Ukrainian language media for mostly sort of self-censorship kind of things. I have not spent the time to try to evaluate these criticisms. I'm curious, as a working journalist in Kyiv, how is the atmosphere for you, and how is the atmosphere for your Ukrainian colleagues writing for Ukrainian publications?
Yeah, I think that let me separate those two questions. I think that the Ukrainian press is, I would say, relatively concerned. I wouldn't say it's their number one priority is that they're worried that the government is cracking down or anything, and I see no evidence of a large scale crackdown. But there have been some specific episodes of the government surveilling journalists, which have been publicized and criticized by Zelensky himself. In a day-to-day perspective, what I'd say is when the full-scale invasion started in 2022, people were very eager to tell their stories, and they were very eager to talk to the press and talk about what they've experienced. 2 years into the war, I think, and this may be a reflection of general morale and exhaustion, people are just less open than they used to be. And I'm not talking about the government and suppression here. I'm talking about the average person. It's gotten a little harder to do the work of journalism because I think people are just utterly worn down. I don't think I could, I've tried in some of our writing on the counteroffensive to convey the fatigue and the grind that is living in a place like Kharkiv or in eastern Ukraine or even in Kyiv, where the news is just constantly bad, even when the battlefield is even when there are kind of ongoing victories on the battlefield. Everyone's getting, all sorts of people around you are getting terrible news on a regular basis, and the war has this horrific, traumatic effect on people, and it winds down even the most psychologically. It wears down even the most psychologically tough folks that I knew over the last couple of years that I thought were just totally solid and totally totally unbeatable mentally, are starting to get ground down and starting to reach their limit in ways that are really surprising to me. And I've never seen this before. The distress from folks who've been fighting for more than 2 years is really very extreme.
So, what is the realistic consequence of that? So, you have a country that is genuinely worn down and yet has no, I think quite intentionally, has no vocabulary of compromise. There's no discussion, could we live with a ceasefire in place? At least not that I've heard. There's no discussion of, oh, could we have a peace on the basis of de facto Russian annexation of Crimea or Donetsk and Luhansk. There's no sense that, oh, Mariupol is gone. And so, how does the kind of determination that this war isn't over until there's victory, and victory means something that most Americans think is a little bit unrealistic, which is the liberation of all occupied Ukrainian territory. How does that determination, which really constrains political vocabulary, collide with this sense of exhaustion and low morale that you're describing?
I think what we're getting into is the question of, how does this all end, right? And how does and can negotiations and discussions about ceasefires and an end to the war really take place, at least from the Ukrainian perspective? You're seeing in public opinion polls an openness to negotiations on some terms. It is ticking up. But I would say that that most Ukrainians are not yet ready to concede that. I think that most Ukrainians haven't been pushed to the point where they would need to concede that. Strategically, it seems obvious to the American military analysts that I talk to that in order to gain any more strategic objectives, Ukraine is going to need to mobilize a significant percentage of the population, hundreds of thousands of new people. When faced with that decision to either negotiate or mobilize, I think there'll be a different, it will settle out that question of openness or not openness in a very stark way. But that decision hasn't been made politically yet. And so right now it's a pretty abstract idea to just go up to a Ukrainian and say, do you support negotiations or victory? I think the vast majority are going to say, let's stick with it. And so right now there just isn't that appetite. But there are going to be events this year that push much more dilemmas for Ukraine. And people, the Ukrainian people will have to make that decision as to what to support and what not to support. Zelensky himself has not given an inch on any of this, and he claims that Ukraine will not give up any claims to any of its territories, and only that can be the basis for any negotiations.
So I want to ask you, before coming back to the publication, I want to ask you about the reaction in Ukraine to the killing of Navalny. There is, at least in the Ukrainian population abroad, a real hostility to Navalny, and that, came out both whenever he would do something that would acquire a lot of Western admiration, but also a sort of very reserved reaction to his death. Um, uh, on the other hand, quietly, a bunch of Ukrainians have expressed admiration to me just about his courage and about his the fact that he was if not a Boris Nemtsov figure, certainly somebody who was opposed to Putin in a way that was um, significant and courageous in a time that mattered. What has been the reaction to you about this figure that the rest of the world admires so much, and yet had this uh, this history of less than attractive statements that about which Ukrainians have a long memory, and who never kind of full-throatedly said Ukraine is a sovereign integral state that Russia has no claim on any of its territory, including the parts that have been annexed.
We're stepping into a highly contentious topic here in Ukrainian society, and I think it can be summed up in the question: is there such a thing as a good Russian? And I think many Ukrainians would tell you no. That Navalny, who has a history, as you alluded to, of making comments about Ukraine that Ukrainians find imperialistic, and was part of, it was part of, was a political candidate in Russia who espoused a number of imperialistic, nationalistic views, particularly when he was running for mayor. Many Ukrainians would make the argument that unless these that Russians come from this sort of colonialistic viewpoint, they're grown in it, they learn in it, and they convey it, and that unless they're unless they're fighting for Ukraine against Russia, they're part of the problem. That's not my view. But that's a view that's been expressed to me countless times here in Ukraine. That Navalny opposed Putin for his own personal sake, and not for the not for the liberation of Ukraine or the easing of Ukraine's suffering. That said, I have spoken to some Ukrainians that will say, "Hey, look, that like Navalny may not have been pro-Ukraine, but you can at least acknowledge that he had the courage of his convictions and returned to Russia when death was the inevitable outcome of that decision." But I've had countless conversations with people and in Ukraine, and they've dismissed my Western liberal view on this, which is that people ought to be judged on their individual views, actions, statements, and philosophies, rather than the group from which they happen to come from. The Ukrainian view on this is obviously grounded in a lot of anger over the deaths of many of their fellow citizens, over a war that never needed to happen.
Yeah, so I want to come back to your phrase, there's no such thing as a good Russian, which is something that if you spend time in Ukrainian communities, for listeners who are going to get angry at me about this, you just hear all the time. And yet each one of these Ukrainian communities has Russians in it, sometimes in relatively sizable numbers. And so, like, the group of people that I have gotten to know in Washington as a result of my embassy projection projects, there's a bunch of Russians who are working with them every day. And if you ask, I'm going to keep names out of this, but if you ask the Ukrainian who will look you in the face and say, in all seriousness, there's no such thing as a good Russian, what about so and so, right? Who let's say, oh, that's different, and it is not obvious from an outsider point of view what actually makes it different. But it is something. There's some test that once people pass, they are accepted, and Navalny never passed that. And even though in his later years he made clear he was talking about 1990 borders, 1991 borders, which of course include Crimea, he, in a number of coded ways, he said, I mean, he opposed the war very actively. But he never said it in the kind of full-throated way that gets you over that hill of mistrust.
I think it may be helpful to go back to the root of why it is that many Ukrainians have this view of collective guilt on the Russian part. And that is, they look at their own history over the last 2 decades. They look at their street protests and their demonstrations and their demands and how they forced, on 2 occasions, the Orange Revolution and the Revolution of Dignity, change in their own system. And they look at the failure of liberal-minded Russians to do the same and say that that is a kind of collective failure that should lead to guilt in all of Russian society and all of the Russians who did not successfully overthrow their government like we did. That I think that would be a key argument for them. They would say, we managed to do it. Your failure to do it means you didn't really want it, and therefore you couldn't be grouped together in condemnation or as being part of that autocratic system. And to be fair to that point, the vast majority of Russians do support the Putin regime, and the vast majority of Russians see no problem whatsoever in the war. But from my liberal-minded view, we still ought to judge people based on their individual attributes and not based on their collective attributes. But I've had endless conversations on this topic with Ukrainians.
So, in connection with the second anniversary of the full-scale invasion, you guys ran an incredible piece about one of the early battles of the war, which many listeners will remember. This was the battle over an airfield that was kind of pivotal in the battle for Kyiv. So talk about the battle and talk about the story you wrote about it.
Yeah, so like I said, the perspective of the publication is to do these kind of first-person reports, try to put you in an immersive way in the perspective of people who are going through the news. And so what we really wanted to do was tell the story of this battle called the Battle of Antonov Airfield, which I think is the most important battle of the war. It happened in the first 72 hours of the full-scale invasion when Russian elite airborne troops tried to capture an airfield just outside of Kyiv. And what they had was a plan to land about a dozen and a half huge Russian cargo planes filled with 1,000 soldiers and armored vehicles right outside of Kyiv, and used that to encircle the city. And what we do is we spent months and months trying to understand how that battle took place, and give some detail about how the Ukrainians denied the Russians that ability, and essentially in the process saved the city of Kyiv, and likely saved Zelensky's life. And it all came down to a small set of decisions. What we do is we detail how 4 artillery pieces that just arrived by rail car into central Kyiv just that day managed to get into position to fire shells onto the airfield right in time to prevent the landing of these huge cargo planes. The whole war's outcome could be substantially different if there hadn't been a series of non-combat troops that were nearby and were just using small arms to fight off elite Russian troops. I mean, it's a really amazing story of just how much Ukrainians, were driven to fight off the Russian invasion. There's a story in it about someone fighting on the Russian side not having any ammo left, and deciding, and upon spotting Russian soldiers on the road around the airfield, just hitting the gas and running over Russian soldiers with his BMW. And I think this has some, I think this has some, items for reflection and consequences for today, which is, as bad as morale might be on the front lines from individual soldiers who are exhausted, Ukraine and the vast majority of Ukrainians have pretty deep motivation to fight and protect their cities and their country. The question is, are they going to get the equipment that they need and the support that they were promised from the West to fight on and yield, whether it's continued battlefield gains in Ukraine or being able to approach negotiations from a position of strength where they have the initiative on the battlefield and they're able to extract concessions. And, I think that's going to be the big question. As long as, I remember someone saying very early in the full-scale invasion that as long as there's a 12-year-old with a plastic knife in Ukraine, there'll be Ukrainian resistance. The question is, do we want the Ukrainians to be fighting with plastic knives, or do we want them to be fighting with 155 millimeter artillery shells, which they desperately need? Those are the big questions right now. And those are the questions Ukrainians are asking me all the time. What do you think the Congress will do? I don't have a good answer for them. I really don't know whether the United States will live up to its promises.
So one thing I'd like you to shape for the listener is that battle for Antonov Airfield. And I will note that the Russian ambassador to the United States is also named Antonov. So it's always given, this story has a particular resonance for me. One thing, how much of it was a victory of the Ukrainian military, and is a kind of top-down, our generals beat your generals, kind of like, Patton versus Rommel kind of. And, but a big part of the story is just individual people taking individual actions, which is also part of the kind of Ukrainian military, a much less centralized kind of vision of, particularly in the early days of the conflict, a much less centralized approach to conflict. So, walk us through how much of this was resistance and how much of this was the armed forces of Ukraine beating the Russian army and elite, you know, elite paratroopers.
This was a story of resistance, not of good planning. Um, there was a National Guard unit stationed at Antonov Airfield. This is just an example. The vast majority of its combat troops had been shipped away from Antonov Airfield in anticipation of possible combat actions in the east. And this is despite American warnings that Antonov Airfield might be a target in a renewed Russian invasion. So the Ukrainians knew that it could be a target and had not exhibited the proper planning to secure that airfield. The only thing that stopped them were a bunch of HR soldiers and a bunch of non-combat soldiers, a bunch of conscripts fighting their hearts out with very limited resources to beat back elite paratroopers. We're talking at this point, anyone with a rifle who was living near the range was living near the airfield was taking pot shots at landing Russian troops. People were running around without appropriate body armor, with a single magazine for their AKs, totally unequipped, totally unprepared, but totally motivated to prevent the Russians from getting a foothold near Kyiv. And by a combination of that motivation and resistance and luck, the timing worked out that a small number of artillery pieces were able to reach within range of the airfield and destroy it. You cannot really say the generals were so well prepared and outmaneuvered the Russians. Zelensky till almost the moment of the full-scale invasion was trying to tamp down speculation that it would occur, even though the United States was screaming from every hill that it could find that an invasion was imminent. I think that what happened was that you saw the spirit of Ukrainian people acting as individuals, trying to do the best they could for their country. And in the end, there was enough luck and there was enough effort to be able to prevent the encirclement and occupation of Kyiv, which is why I'm able to talk to you from this city today. In my opinion, is this battle, is the outcome of this battle, because having failed to secure that airfield, Russian troops were then forced to go overland, and they got stuck in that terrible quagmire that you'll remember from the early days of the war. These huge columns of easily targetable Russian troops running out of gas, running low on supplies, and just getting torn up by Ukrainian defenders from all sides. That was only possible because they were denied this air bridge in Antonov Airfield. And so it's a really compelling and interesting story. This is why I wanted to dig into it so much, is because I really think that was the pivotal moment.
So we are again at a pivotal moment. And as you describe, kind of big decisions both on the U.S. side and the Ukrainian side are, going to happen in the next 3 to 6 months. As you look forward, what are the big things that you are watching at the macro level?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, whether it's a discharge petition, whether it's whether the speaker somehow is convinced to bring it to the floor, the big strategic question is, will U.S. aid resume to Ukraine? And if not, when will we know for sure? Failing that, does the Biden administration decide to use some of its other authorities to provide stopgap assistance in some way? And to how big will that be? That's a major unanswered question. The second question is one that's both political and military related, which is whether the political class in Ukraine will decide for another round of mobilization, and how large will it be, and what will be the pushback from Ukrainian society. Many Ukrainians don't want their children to be sent off to war, and who could blame them? But I think that that they'll ultimately be forced to choose between the status quo and negotiations or another round of mobilization, because the soldiers on the front lines have been fighting now continuously for more than 2 years. We don't expect that of any American soldier. American soldiers are typically rotated in theater during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars for periods of between 3 months and 9 months. These soldiers have been fighting in trenches with hardly any breaks at all. We're talking maybe 10 days off in 2 years, in appalling conditions and under constant stress and threat of death. And their ability to be effective for, offensive operations is, I think, pretty limited without new trainees coming in to alleviate some of the burden. Those are going to be the big macro issues that I look at. Outside of Ukraine, I'm really interested in how this isn't merely a war between Russia and Ukraine, but it's a battle between the world's democracies and the authoritarians who oppose it. You see Chinese messaging in Taiwan about how you can't trust Americans, and what they point at is how the United States hasn't kept its word in defending Ukraine to the extent that it's said that it would from the beginning. China is trying to use this struggle and American reluctance as a way to drive a wedge between Taiwan and the United States. China probably will likely use that same line with South Korea or Japan, and point out or argue that the United States can't ultimately be trusted. They can only be trusted for as long as they have attention on your conflict, and when there's some shiny new development, they'll get distracted and move on to something else. So I'll be watching that really closely. Actually, the Counteroffensive has launched a Taiwan monthly supplemental, so we're covering the Taiwan situation pretty closely as well. And it's a topic that really deeply interests me too.
We're going to leave it there. The publication is The Counteroffensive. The name remains unchanged. My guest has been Tim Mak. Many of you know his voice from NPR, where he used to report from Kyiv. He's still reporting from Kyiv, but now on his own. Tim, so great to talk to you again.
Thanks so much. And your listeners can check out our publication at www.counteroffensive.news.